Good evening and good morning to all of our participants. Thank you for joining us for this session on opportunities for enhanced near-term US-China climate action with a focus on decarbonizing the building sector. I'm Jen Perrin. I'm a senior climate policy fellow with the California-China Climate Institute and will be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. Before we do get started, I want to offer a few quick housekeeping remarks. So we are recording this event. It will later be available on our website, ccci.berkeley.edu, and also on our YouTube channel. In addition, this event is being simultaneously translated into Mandarin Chinese. To select the preferred language that you would like to listen in, please click on the globe icon at the base of your screen to choose either Mandarin or English. In addition, throughout today's discussion, if you would like to ask a question of one of our panelists, you are welcome to drop that into the question and answer box at the base of your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we're able to live. So now we'll go ahead and get started with this evening's program. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by a range of issue experts who are going to share more about opportunities for both the US and China to tackle emissions reductions from the building sector, with a focus really in on this next decade primarily. We'll also be taking a closer look at a subnational example from here in the state of California. To start off, I'm very happy to introduce our first presenter who will share some opening remarks. Bob Weisenmiller is a research affiliate with the California-China Climate Institute and the former chair of the California Energy Commission. For more than 9 years, Bob served at the Energy Commission under both Republican and Democratic administrations, helping to shape California's energy policy. Bob has provided expert testimony to more than 100 state and federal public regulatory agencies and court proceedings. We're delighted to have you with us here today, Bob. I'll turn it over to you for some opening remarks.
Thank you. Again, I'd like to say good morning and good evening to our participants. I'm going to start with some basics and a little bit of history. As noted in the announcement for this event, buildings contribute about 40% to the globe's greenhouse gas emissions and consume about 3/4 of the electricity used in the United States. At the same time, China has the largest building stock in the world and corresponds to about half of the globe's new building area. Buildings also contribute significantly to industrial emissions from the production of construction materials like concrete and steel. For a lot of us, energy really became an important issue with the Arab oil embargo of 1973. And that was a time when America's physicists and scientists got together to study energy issues. And professors like Art Rosenfeld and Rob Socolow both were part of that original APS meeting. And realistically, everyone has houses. And real estate was really a big thing in Princeton and Berkeley at that time. And so lo and behold, the Princeton and Berkeley groups both really focused on buildings, on homes, and on their energy consumption and how to reduce that in the great variety. Again, when you look at California, we have about 14 million homes in 2020. Most of those are single family, but increasingly we have a lot of multifamily units. Those buildings last, I was going to say, at least 50 years. My house was built in 1909. It was substantially remodeled in 1992. God knows it may have been remodeled earlier than that. But again, houses are really a significant long-term contribution. And, again, are part of our lives, really, on the energy side. California has about 100,000 new homes built each year. I'd say about 60% single family and about 40% multifamily. Obviously, there have been times when the numbers have been bigger and times when it's been smaller. But again, if you think about the relationship between the 14 million and the 100,000, you can tell that it's a very slow turnover. Looking at the Energy Commission was established in 1974 when Governor Reagan signed the Warren-Alquist Act. And a lot of the scope for the Energy Commission's legislation at that time was a RAND study that was really led by Dr. Ronald Doctor. So Dr. Doctor ultimately became one of the original five energy commissioners. And he was very focused on energy efficiency. I was an advisor to him for a year. So was John Giesman, so was Jim Harding. So really, he was one of the leading forces for energy efficiency in California at that stage. And he obviously ran the first Title 24 standards, also the first appliance standards. The first standards were adopted in 1978. And they are updated, I was going to say, about every 3 years. They get progressively more difficult. So in California, again, about half of the existing buildings were built before the first 1978 standards, which would be considered very weak nowadays. There are lots of existing buildings. And so in the 1970s, we were also trying to figure out how to address existing buildings. And so a lot of local governments like Berkeley put in place retrofit ordinances at time of sale. And that really started moving towards retrofitting existing buildings more. We also had a lot of focus on utilities doing audits of buildings. The retrofit push, I would say one of the major leaders there was Tom Hayden. Tom was head of the Western Sun and really focused again on that grassroots political movement around retrofit. Right now, Title 24 standards, as I said, were updated every 3 years. So 48 years from 2022 to 1974, so roughly 16 building standards. And the standards not only apply to new construction, but substantial remodels. So we'll pick up the remodel part. There's been a lot of players in the building standards every year. NRDC has been a major player. Certainly the building industry under CBIA is a major player. And at this point, a lot of local governments do local ordinances also. Typically, they're the next Title 24 upgrades. I mean, if we're talking about, doing something with solar, then again, they would start putting solar into that. And that would put pressure on the builders who would rather deal with one standard than to deal with 20 or 30 individual standards at the different local governments. But basically, we need to focus on both new buildings and also retrofitting existing buildings. Again, they're two very distinct markets, very different opportunities there. And we originally were focused very much on saving energy. And now more and more the focus is on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, air quality has always been an issue. There's a CEQA review as part of the building standards, and one has to look at things like air quality impacts from the standards. Most recent standards are very, very focused on greenhouse gas savings, but basically save your questions on the nuts and bolts of the current and next building standards for Commissioner McAllister, who's also on the program today. So again, thank you for the opportunity to provide some context.
Thank you so much, Bob, including for your leadership within the state of California.
Thank you.
Next, I have the pleasure of introducing a set of panelists who will be providing remarks today and discussing some of the near and midterm opportunities for the U.S. and China to help address some of those issues that Bob teed up from here in the state. So first we'll be hearing from Stephanie Green, who is a managing director at the Rocky Mountain Institute, or RMI. Stephanie leads the carbon-free buildings program at RMI and helped launch and expand its buildings electrification initiative. And following Stephanie, we'll hear from Commissioner Andrew McAllister, who is a commissioner with the California Energy Commission and who's going to speak about California's work in reducing building emissions. Commissioner McAllister leads the Commission's work on energy efficiency, including the building energy efficiency standards and work on appliance efficiency and load management and flexibility. And then following that, we'll hear from Nan Zhou, who is a senior scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory and the technical program manager of the Net Zero World Initiative. She's also the co-chair of the Academic Advisory Committee here at the California China Climate Institute. And Nan has led many international programs at the lab on energy efficiency and greenhouse gas mitigation, often focused on China. So we'll start with you, Stephanie, and then proceed in that sequence through the panel. So I'll turn it over to you, Stephanie.
Great, thank you so much. And I first wanted to start by thanking Mr. Weisenmiller, Commissioner McAllister. They've been showing incredible leadership in California on the built environment for so long, and it's an honor to be here today. Let me adjust, my apologies here. Let me just adjust this into slideshow mode. Can everyone see that? I think, okay, that looks good to me. All right. So hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Green. I lived in the Bay Area for 20 years. I'm currently based in Boulder, working at the Rocky Mountain Institute, but I'm so glad to be here today to talk about, I'm focused on the US building sector, but you know, California has really been a leader. And so I'm gonna explain how, where I see a lot of the policies that have started in California are really taking root across the US and the opportunities that that creates. So I'll start by saying that certainly the reason that I get really excited and motivated to work on buildings is that we have not made a lot of progress in this sector. So the good news is there's been a lot of new construction, and so we have made progress in terms of keeping emissions flat. But we have not made progress in terms of dramatically bringing emissions down. And so this is a US total, and so we've made significant progress in electricity emissions, and I think this would show even further downward trajectory in California with its very bold commitments on renewables. But we just can't quite get there on buildings, and so I think this is the decade, this is the decisive decade when we need to, in order to stay climate aligned. And then some statistics that I find very striking are that we're continuing to move in the wrong direction. So we're digging the hole deeper, and we are adding a new customer to the US gas system. I'll get into why that matters for buildings, but you know, a lot of that's build out of the gas distribution system and connecting residential and commercial buildings to that system. And that creates a stranded asset concern as well as customer cost concern because of how long buildings last, right? If you are building out a gas pipeline to a building that's still going to be here in 50 years, that asset is not will not be able to emit gas, fossil gas, in order to stay climate aligned. So that's a challenge we have to address now, and hopefully think through how do we best shrink the distribution system to minimize customer costs and to make sure we stay climate aligned. And then the next is there's just the pace of new construction across the global south is very, very significant. So as Mr. Weisenmiller said, this is both a new construction challenge and a retrofit challenge. So yeah, we have basically the square footage, the size of New York City is being built every month. And so we have to make sure in the global south that we are keeping ahead of that new construction. So let's deep dive in the US here. A lot of emissions that we're focused on our team, we look at both energy efficiency and the decarbonizing electricity behind that. And then we also look at the direct on-site emissions that come from space and water heating primarily, as well as cooking and some other uses. And as you can see, there are over 70 million homes and businesses across the US that burn on-site fossil fuels. And that's out of a total building stock of around 120 million. And what's amazing about that is about 90% of those 120 million buildings are single family homes. But half of the emissions come from the commercial sector because the buildings are so much larger, there's so much more square footage. So we really have to address both residential and commercial buildings, and we have to address new construction, and we have to address retrofits. Okay, so now that I've depressed everyone about how hard this is, I want to say that what's awesome is that a better building can make people's lives so much better. We spend so much time in buildings. We spend 90% of our lives in buildings. And so the indoor air quality impacts that come from living inside of a building with potential impacts from nitrogen dioxide emissions that might come from cooking, or other emissions that come from poorly ventilated spaces, light that comes from a really well-built net zero building can be significantly better. The space can be more comfortable to live in, and more resilient, frankly, in times of wildfires or other types of things. People can be safer in their homes if they are well insulated and energy efficient. And then we also really impact the operational costs of a person's home. There's a very significant number of households that basically struggle to pay energy bills on top of their everyday food and other basic needs. And so by through energy efficiency and other operational cost reductions, we can improve that in people's lives. And then the science shows that we have significant nitrogen dioxide emissions that come from homes that have gas stoves versus electric. So we can also improve indoor air quality. There is a correlation between nitrogen dioxide emissions and asthma, especially in young children. So we can have a wonderful impact on people's lives by making better buildings. Next slide, please. Oh wait, my apologies. I did a different talk today where I was not projecting the slides. So thanks for your patience with my slide management here. Okay, so I just want to make sure we're all aligned on what we're talking about with a zero carbon building. The societally least cost way to get to a zero carbon building is to electrify that building and to decarbonize the electricity that powers the building. Those buildings must be highly energy efficient. This is particularly important in cold climate zones, like the Northeast of the US, the Midwest. Grid interactive activity can help with renewables integration. It can help with making sure we're not overbuilding the electricity system to accommodate these electrified and efficient buildings. And then ideally, they're built with zero embodied carbon. And what that means is the concrete, the steel, and the other construction materials that go into those buildings should be zero carbon. And that's basically impossible to do today, frankly, with the way that those materials are built, but we can have lower embodied carbon procurement standards that can be implemented today through things like Buy Clean or other policies. So with that, I'm going to dive pretty quickly into, at a really high level, the policy recommendations that RMI and my team made for how we think we can best decarbonize the US building sector. And then I'm going to give an example from a few different states and the Inflation Reduction Act. So overall, we need to tackle new construction. And because, again, buildings last so long, we have to build them right from the start if we can. And they are also, it is the most economic choice to build an all-electric, highly energy efficient home than it is to not. So that's good news. Title 24, I know Commissioner McAllister will speak about that, was a great leadership example of how we can have electric preferred, or a way to incentivize lower cost for electrification for new construction. Washington State has passed something very similar for residential and commercial codes. There's also Buy Clean policies that enable state governments and agencies to create specifications for lower carbon materials for the concrete that they buy for roads, for the steel they use. And so that is an excellent way to create a demand signal to lower the carbon content of those materials. And then finally, we have to make sure that gas customers are not subsidizing the expansion of the system in a way that would create potential stranded costs down the road. And then we need to continue to provide incentives as much as we can, especially for low and moderate income households, for a zero carbon building. And then finally, we need to tackle retrofits, and that's hard because there are so many buildings and it's so many distributed stakeholders, right? 90% of those 120 million buildings are single family homes. And so to really get there, we need to think through how do we have policies that can make that easier. And so one example is the California Air Resources Board passed a zero NOx emissions standard or has proposed for gas furnaces and water heaters. And that's an example of something that will lower NOx emissions in the state of California, and will also ensure that upon equipment replacement, those appliances would be non-gas appliances. So that's an example of a regulation that would help with retrofits, and then weatherization assistance, retrofit funding, such as that's provided through the Inflation Reduction Act and others is also a really important mechanism. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the slide. I want to be really cognizant of time, but suffice it to say that we are seeing a huge array of different policies across the country, at the city, at the state, and at the federal level that implement some of what I just suggested, which is so great to see. There's a lot more we need to continue to do, but we are seeing progress across a lot of states. States I'll call out here are California, Washington, New York. There's cities in Colorado that are making significant progress. And then finally, the Inflation Reduction Act. So again, this is a complicated piece of legislation, has a lot of parts, but what I'll say is it's awesome in terms of the incentives it provides for buildings. And most of those incentives come from a mixture of upfront rebates and incentives for both electrification and energy efficiency, as well as tax credits. And so this is an estimate from the Congressional Budget Office, but the tax credits in theory are unlimited in how many could be used, right? So we think by our estimate, and this is from the repeat project, but RMI has made similar estimates, around 50 billion or more dollars will be directed towards the building sector, which is amazing progress. And then these are some details. I'm not going to go into all of them, but you can see how this funding is distributed across rebate programs, across tax credits. And again, there's a mixture here of our zero carbon recipes. So energy efficiency, electrification incentives. For LMI households, for an example, they have up to $14,000 in upfront incentives for panel upgrades, heat pump purchases, heat pump hot water heaters, etc. And then there's also some incredible programs to address embodied carbon and low carbon materials, which we were also really excited to see. And then also contractor training. So we really need to think through how are we preparing the workforce as we create a whole new opportunity for local job creation, for retrofitting those 70+ million buildings across the US that need more electrification and efficiency in order to be fully decarbonized. So that's all I'm going to share today. Thank you all so much for having me, and I look forward to the questions. Yeah, I'm not going to go into this, but I can share it afterwards to anyone who's interested.
Should I just jump right in? Great. All right. Let me just share my screen. And go into the interview. Okay. Oh no, actually, I'm sorry for the snafu. Give me 1 second. Right there. Okay, great. Hopefully that looks like it should look. Well, great. It's really delightful to be here. I want to thank Bob Weissenmiller. I want to call him Chair Weissenmiller because we served on the Energy Commission together for many years. As Bob said, we really are standing on the shoulders of giants here in terms of the discipline and the practice of energy efficiency. From the early days of the Energy Commission, when they really were making these processes out of whole cloth for the first time, it had never been done. And now we really have these standards making enterprises fully institutionalized and really out there changing the world building by building, and making our buildings in California being the best they can be, since they are among the most long-lived assets that we have, and they need to perform throughout their lifetimes. And so I want to just go over a few relevant points here, trying not to duplicate many of the things in the previous presentation there. That was really, that was fantastic. And thanks very much, Stephanie. Really appreciate all the RMI's work. And so most of the activities that Stephanie described are happening in one way or another in California at the local, regional, or state level. And she mentioned a few of those examples. But I wanted to just talk about Title 24 building energy efficiency standards, and also building benchmarking and performance standards. A few other topics sprinkled along the way here. There we go. So California's buildings, as Bob said, anyway, they account for about a quarter of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. About half of those emissions are from the electricity that the buildings use, and the other half, roughly, is from on-site combustion of fossil gas. And so in California, the grid is being cleaned up relatively quickly, as Stephanie said, and so that will essentially leave the lion's share of the problem with the on-site combustion of gas. And so electrification is the primary strategy to move beyond that carbon footprint. So a couple of years ago, we did, this is sort of a summary of the California built environment. A couple of years ago, we did a study at the behest of the legislature about the trajectory that we need to get to 40% below 1990 levels from our buildings emissions, in our buildings emissions. And so we looked at that, and it emerged that electrification really must be the primary strategy, and we have to really proceed to get at our existing buildings in earnest, because that's where the lion's share, that's where the bulk of those emissions are going to come from for the foreseeable future. New construction, I'll talk about that with Title 24, but we really can't do it alone with new construction. We really have to get into our existing buildings. The building code produces, it sets minimum standards for new construction, obviously. And the code is sort of marching in a decarbonizing direction. And so on the left, you have the tons of CO2 equivalent that are produced by the footprint of the buildings under the certain code annually. And you can see the 2019 code. The previous code, roughly 2016, is the 2019 code without solars on the left. Then the 2019 code actually did include mandatory solar for residential new construction. And so that whittled away the carbon footprint a little bit more. And then the 2022 code includes additional efficiency and some additional solar in multifamily housing and in some commercial housing or commercial building types. And so over time, the code is getting more and more stringent, and we're whittling away and encouraging electrification. So we actively encourage heat pumps, which are a key technology to get rid of water and space heating combustion. So heat pumps, they're ready for prime time in the marketplace. Building an all-electric building does have some advantages versus a dual fuel building. And in terms of the relative cost of putting in gas piping versus electric wiring. And we really ratcheted down in that 2022 code update the energy budget for a new building. So each building has to meet an energy budget that's based on some minimum required equipment and building shell characteristics. And we made that stringent enough that in order to put in fossil-based, combustion-based heat for water and or space heating, you have to improve the building efficiency in other ways so much to make up for the efficiency difference that you gain with a heat pump. And so by having a heat pump baseline, we really made it more challenging to put in gas appliances. And what we're going to see, what we are already seeing and hearing from the builders, is that it's just going to be give them more flexibility and save them some money actually when they build all electric. And so some of the builders are moving that direction, and we expect most of them to follow along. So the 2025 code will further support that direction. We're looking at load flexibility, energy storage, and some other kind of complementary decarbonization efforts, vehicle readiness as well. So, let's see I actually won't go over this too much, but I think the key point is the middle one about the saturation of combustion devices. California, actually, Stephanie mentioned the hole that we're digging. Well, over the last few decades, California has actually extended its gas grid to cover most of the state. Roughly 90% of consumers have gas distribution at their doorstep. And so over time, we've actually increased the penetration of heating end uses, both for space and water and for cooking in California. So, the vast majority of homes actually use gas for heating and for cooking, and especially for water heating. So those devices in existing buildings, we need to really focus on with these programs with state and federal funds that we'll be implementing over the next couple of years. We also are, I'll just mention, we're looking at all of our programs through an equity lens. We know that roughly a third, 35% or so Californians really don't have the disposable income to make these investments, to shift over their end uses from gas to electricity. And so that's a challenge, obviously, that we have to solve. And so we really need to transform that marketplace, get costs down, work with contractors and manufacturers of all this equipment to get costs down while maintaining quality of installation and really focusing on the people who need the subsidies the most, and bring the rest of the market along over time with both policies that are carrots and other policies that are more sticks. Again, this is a picture that just illustrates that California and a couple of other states have a high prevalence of gas cooking. And this is important, as Stephanie said, for public health reasons. And that's another area that we're looking at to see if we can partner with the public health sector to bring in some capital from the health services, because they will save a lot of money if they can decrease the prevalence of childhood asthma, emergency room visits, things like that. So there's an argument to be made that a health system should be subsidizing the switch from gas to electric cooktops. That's a really interesting conversation right now. But the 7 strategies for building decarbonization in our existing buildings, largely, this applies to new, but I think the challenge is mostly with existing buildings. We include building end use electrification and decarbonizing the electric generation system, energy efficiency. So Stephanie mentioned all of those. Refrigerant leakage is also very important. We need to migrate our refrigerants over to low greenhouse gas potential refrigerants. So that's ongoing and very, very important, because greenhouse gases or refrigerants that are currently in the most use, widest use, have a very high greenhouse gas potential, or global warming potential. So that market is shifting slowly over to low GWP refrigerants. And then distributed energy resources like solar, alongside and load flexibility. Those are also key components of a decarbonized building. The buildings need to play nicely on the grid. They need to be good citizens of the grid. And that means having flexible loads that can use the renewable energy when it's available. For example, excess solar during the day or wind at night through much of the year, and not use energy when it's higher carbon content. And then also decarbonizing the gas system is another strategy for those remaining gas end uses. I wanted just to mention quickly our benchmarking program, and that'll lead into some building performance standards that I want to talk about just briefly and then wrap up. We do have a mandatory benchmarking requirement for all buildings, commercial and multifamily, above 50,000 square feet. And this is just a snapshot of an interactive tool that we have on our website that you can slice and dice within jurisdictions, however you like, to look at the building population and its energy consumption through a benchmarking lens. And so that's a great platform to then move on to policies that help those buildings, particularly the least performing buildings, the worst performing buildings, to improve over time. And that policy is called a building performance standard. And so California just joined, by far the largest jurisdiction to join the National Building Performance Coalition. Building Performance Standards Coalition that the White House has been leading for the last couple of years. And so it's a exciting policy mechanism to set goals for buildings and then craft a series of policies and hopefully financing resources and technical resources that will help those buildings then achieve those goals. And then over time, moving towards a more mandatory standard for those existing buildings. So start with some carrots and end up with some sticks to get the laggards. So lots of investments here. I think I'll just I think you can see that there are a lot of different funding sources and programs, both at the state level with the Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission, with ratepayer funds, with general funds from the state budget, and then also from the federal government, largely via the U.S. Department of Energy. So all this adds up to unprecedented investments in our built environment, and we need to take advantage of this. We need to make the most of these resources. We have a couple of $1 billion, say, in California to invest over the next few years, which sounds like a lot of money, but in a state that's as big as ours, with almost 40 million people and 15 million buildings, that will not go very far. We really need about 2 orders of magnitude larger than the funding we have for the next few years. So really, we need to make these a success and then build on those with more investments. So that's where I'm going to end up, but looking forward to having some time for a Q&A. Thank you very much.
Okay, and let's move to thousands of miles away and from the US to China. So I'm very delighted to be one of the panelists to talk about the decarbonization of building sectors in China. So our previous speakers, Andrew and Stephanie, provide a very comprehensive and a very impressive list of policies, measures US and California state government has been doing and for decarbonizing the US building sector. In China, building sector right now accounts for roughly 25, a quarter of the total emission. It's still growing. And the magnitude of building energy consumption, however, is much larger. And because of the massive build out happening in China, urbanization and population growth, each year, and China has been putting 2 billion square meters of new build in the country. So almost half of the global new construction is happening there. And therefore, as a result, half of the steel production, half of the cement, almost half of the glass, all of those, and even heavy industrial outputs are also produced in China as a result of building and the infrastructure and build out. Okay, so I will talk about some of the key policies Chinese government has implemented in building sector, and also about our future scenarios and outlook for the sector and how do we decarbonize it. So next, please. Okay, so China has made impressive progress toward the carbon neutrality and the peaking of emissions by 2030. And recently, they have announced even more ambitious policies and targets and to help achieve these various climate and goals and the pledges. And they have, so this slide gives you a list of all the policy recently being announced or implemented and in the different sectors. Importantly, the 14th five-year plan and for all the sectors. I want to call out the building sector and the Chinese government has announced a number of pilot program for building energy efficiency improvement, promote further codes and standards and updates, and to achieve ultra low and near zero energy buildings and the renewable energy and application in buildings and electrification. And the green cooling action plan also announced in 2019. Next, please. And so this slide shows shows some concrete and building sector specific targets. And as you can know notice, and some of these targets were not included in the previous 5-year plan. So this is a breakthrough. And in the 14th 5-year plan, for example, we now have targets for and electrification rate in buildings, and which was non-existent in the past. But now we have a very ambitious target for reaching 55% in 2025. That's only 2 to 3 years away from now. And also there are also other targets for ultra low energy buildings need to reach 50% to 50 million square meters from only 10 in 2020. And also similarly, these renewable energy and applications, targets, and interestingly, prefabricated building in urban new construction, and the rate needs to be improved to 30%. And so these are very encouraging and policy and updates and China has. Okay, next, please. So next, I will show you some of our very recent study and the results from this China Energy Outlook. And then you can see this in total CO2 emissions in China by different sector in the last 40 years on the left-hand side. And also, if you look at the future trajectory and out to 2050 by sector, and you will see a complete reversal from the past. And so to achieve carbon neutrality, we must embark a deep mitigation scenario like this. And that's going to look completely different from the past 40 years. And so this can show how daunting and the problem we have, and also and the tremendous effort needs to be put in to turn the trajectory. And then you see in this right-hand chart, and overall the CO2 emissions can be largely reduced. It's not a zero yet. So the remaining may need to be filled by carbon removal or CCUS technologies. And if we look at these by sector, building sector, which is shown in the dark blue, actually is one of the first and to almost fully decarbonize. And whereas other sectors such as industry will still have about a third remaining by 2050, and then transport and we'll still have a small percentage, roughly quarter left in the system. So building sector actually has the most potential with a lot of commercialized technologies, mature, cost effective. We know how to do it. And so we need to really deploy these technologies and from tomorrow. Next, please. So if we really and dive a little bit into the building sector, if we look at the by end uses, the left-hand side provides this chart as a total final energy consumption and by 2050. And then future energy consumption will continue to grow until 2030, and then we'll start kind of a decline. And you can see that by different end uses and space heating and cooking and are a large energy consumer, and also appliances, equipment, all of those will decline. Although some of the sectors like appliances, like equipment, because of electrification going on, they actually will remain relatively same. But if you look at the right-hand side, the CO2 emissions, that could be largely reduced almost to zero. So that is because a lot of the decarbonization in power sector happening, and that result in the significant reduction of CO2 emissions. Next, please. And this slide shows a comprehensive list of strategies we will need to deploy in the building sector. And we categorize them in these 4 buckets. So it includes demand reduction, which is very important. And we talked a lot about the renewable energy, solar PV panel, wind turbine for clean electricity. But if we don't reduce the demand through efficiencies, through activity reduction, behavior change, and we'll not be able to offset the growth in the sector. And that these requires better building standards and better building codes, and many of these measures, and Andrew and Stephanie all talked about, and also clean construction, and that includes a possibly prefabricated building methods, so we can deploy and efficient and zero energy building as a system, as a product, and to get to the speed and the scale. And also fuel switching to electricity-based heating and cooking, which is a hard to abate sector in building sector. The clean district heating, which is currently used in the northern China area, and also needs to be electrified and also potentially combined with biomass and waste heat utilization. And lastly, in the implementing distributed and the solar roof top PV, and also including demand response, and some of these and the measures will be all important. And next, please. So where we are and where do we need to go? And this slide is striking once we have completed study. And so if we look at the these targets we need to achieve in order to meet the carbon neutrality targets. And then if we compare these 2050 goals and with where we stand today, 2021 or 2022 level, and you see across all the key indicators, and we have a large gap to fill. And for example, net zero energy buildings need to achieve 60% by 2050 today, and accounts for almost zero. And so that needs to be in 3 years, needs to be 10%. And then in 13 years, it needs to be 24%. Similarly, electrification of heating today, very little, 2%. And that needs to be 45% by 2050. And also the efficiency of all the equipment, it needs to be more than double. And with cooling, it needs to be increased, and also by 1.5 times. And so you can see these and the gap we have in meeting the ambitious target. And also, and all these needs to be accelerated into using policy and the market mechanism I will touch on very quickly. Next, please. So there are existing and measures, systems, and the policies in place. And Andrew also mentioned about what California has done to meet its own net zero energy building targets through many of the policies. And this slide is from the IPCC and recently released a 6th assessment report findings and for the building sector. And the key conclusion is that building sector and has a possibility to reach net zero and in 2050. And the action in this decade is critical for fully capture the potential, and also requires ambitious policy packages and involves retrofitting existing building and also effective and mitigation techniques in new buildings. And so not just from these international studies, I want to mention, and these case studies also exist in China. So on the right hand bottom part of the slide, you can see two examples of the buildings in China. Shenzhen IBR office building situated in Shenzhen, and where it's hot and humid, and the passive house project in Qinhuangdao, and which is located in northern China. And then you can see, and the energy efficiency or energy reduction compared with the conventional building is significant. So they can achieve 60 or 70% lower compared with average building. Combined with the solar PV panel, they're really and near zero or net zero energy building. And in terms of costs, they're either even lower or only and marginally higher than conventional building. So and these and the system and exists in the real world. It's not just in theory. Next, please. So Andrew already mentioned an example of policies in California, so I don't have to touch on these, but I just want to quickly mention California's net zero zero energy building targets are supported by very strong enabling policies like building codes, appliance standards, and also these other policies, incentives to promote load flexibility and efficiency. And a long range of things that we're currently doing to ensure the net zero energy building targets are met. And so next, please. So what do we do in China? And we can follow some of those trajectories. In some areas, China may be doing better. On top of that, I think Stephanie also mentioned about embodied emission, and which in China is also a significant part of the overall emission. So this chart on the left of pie charts shows the operational and embodied emission in China and the US. And you can see the embodied emission in China is much larger in terms of share because they have a relatively shorter building lifetime, and also because some of the material quality and are not as strength and strength as the ones in the US. So in our recent study, we found that significant potential exists in decarbonizing the building materials and reducing the embodied emission. So this chart shows, and most of the reduction and potential for the building material is actually within material efficiency through extended building lifetime, increased adoption of prefabricated building methods, and also better building design. And so we don't use as much materials such as cement and steel and alternative materials, and we could also use. And then also there are different types of cement, different fuels we could utilize combined with CCS. It actually has the potential and to be fully decarbonized as well. Although this is the only technological potential and there are significant cost economic barrier we need to also overcome. Next, please. I believe this is last. So to summarize, and all of these measures we evaluated are cost effective and available today, and deployment will be key. And so the near term, these are the things China could do and to further accelerate the adoption of these technologies in all the areas I mentioned. In the long term, and research and additional potentials in AI application and for smart controls, and also further research development and to bring the cost down for zero emission building materials. So with that, I think I will just conclude my talk. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nan, and to all of our panelists thus far. By way of reminder to our audience, if you have any questions for our panelists, please do enter them in the Q&A function at the base of your screen. We'll be turning to that shortly. But before we do, I want to turn it over to Anand Gopal for some closing reflections. Anand is Energy Innovation's Executive Director of Policy Research, where he leads the firm's research and modeling teams, supporting policy design to reduce emissions equitably at the speed and scale required to meet the climate challenge. He has worked in clean energy and climate for over 2 decades, predominantly in policy analysis. So we're delighted to have him with us here today, and he's going to offer some closing reflections, kind of tying it all together, kind of what we've heard today. So over to you, Anand.
Thank you, Jen. It's an honor to be part of this panel with so many people who've done a lot in California in terms of policy making, and also great research in China by Nanzhou and her team, as well as Stephanie and others at RMI. I think what I want to highlight here is that the technologies and solutions, as we've heard today, for zero emissions buildings, at least in terms of on-site energy use, they're here today, widely available. There's nothing you need to invent that's new. The building material side is a little bit more complex, but we can go a long way in terms of on-site energy use and emissions. And the solution is also clear. It's electrification quickly and at scale for all the things that we need and use in our home. Stephanie already spoke to a little bit about the indoor air quality and asthma impacts of gas stoves. But let me highlight some recent findings, or re-emphasize them, because they've been in the news by her colleagues at RMI, which is that they found that 12.7% of childhood asthma cases in the US is attributable to gas stove use. And earlier research by them also showed that nitrogen dioxide emissions are 40 to 400% higher in homes with electric stoves. So that's substantial, and it's not something that most people are really aware of. And I think this has come as quite a big surprise for lots of folks who thought gas was the ultimate destination in terms of going clean for air quality, at least. But there are also like a lot of other benefits to going electric. Again, summarizing some of the remarks made by my fellow panelists, in a succinct way, there's research that shows that a new all-electric single-family home in the US, in New York City especially, is less expensive than a new mixed-fuel home that relies on gas for cooking, space heating, and water heating. Basically, over a 15-year period, those savings are as high as $6,800, where an all-electric home also then results in 81% lower carbon emissions over the mixed-fuel home. And as the grid cleans up to zero emissions, it's basically zero emissions, which is pretty amazing. But importantly, like, not only does electrification save money, the homes that are all electric are just superior. Heat pumps result in more comfort. Induction stoves are just better for the cooking experience. My colleague at Energy Innovation, Sarah Baldwin, hosts a podcast called Electrify This. I highly recommend that podcast for people interested in electrification, where she recently, in one of these episodes, interviews a high-end restaurant chef. And the chefs talked about how for a trial period within their restaurant, they had both the gas option and the induction option. And just within 2 or 3 weeks of having both options, like, the entire team, the cooking team, gravitated naturally toward induction, not for climate reasons or health reasons or anything else, just because to make the precise and high-end meals and gourmet food that the restaurant made, it was just better to use induction. It was more precise and easier for them to make the food. In our neighborhood, I live in Oakland, California, we installed a heat pump for heating in 2019. A few neighbors talked to us, and a couple of them also got heat pumps. And they all comment on how much more comfortable their homes are with the heat pump relative to the previous natural gas furnace that was in the house. But here's the interesting thing. In a changing climate, this is not something that it was even in our radar in 2019, a mere 4 years ago. Summers in the Bay Area, which are normally considered pretty mild, have not been mild. 2020, 2021, 2022 have all seen some severe heat waves. And remember, a heat pump system for heating can also cool your house. And I've been surprised by how many times we've had to use the heat pump in cooling mode in the summer to adapt to the very, very hot climate that's happening here. So in conclusion, what can the US and China do, right? Based on our work at Energy Innovation, the answer, we believe, really lies in coordinated, stringent policy. Building codes and appliance standards are complementary tools that simultaneously reduce emissions. They enhance building performance and improve comfort, safety, and health. And there are lots of codes that have like taken the leap beyond LEED. LEED is well referred to as a gold standard here, but now there's a decarbonization code by the National Buildings Institute. And California, like Commissioner McAllister pointed out, is leading the way on building codes at the moment in the US. But even their most recent code still allows for natural gas appliances and stoves. So in a spirit of friendly competition, I encourage China's provinces and other regions to leapfrog us with the adoption of an all-electric code at the outset. That would make China leaders in the building space. China can also make a pretty large difference by just focusing a lot on new construction to be all-electric, because the rate at which new construction is added in China will make a huge difference in 2050 because the building stock is still growing. While in the US, we are very much, if we don't tackle existing stock, we're not going to be able to solve the problem because we've already kind of reached saturation in terms of the amounts of buildings in the country. And another space where it would be nice to see some friendly competition would be to exploit the natural synergy that comes from on-site distributed solar and energy storage systems and in all-electric buildings. Basically, creating policy to combine these distributed energy resources with electric buildings can just make them more resilient and more supportive of the overall grid. And Commissioner McAllister referred to this. If we can avoid high costs and increasing peaks from electrification by using strategic preheating of buildings or strategic preheating of water, and when the price of power is low or when the sun is shining, and then storing that up for when demand goes up, that's something that can be done with all electric appliances that is not possible with gas appliances. And that's something that China actually manufactures and has a lot of these electronics and other equipment that's needed to make smart buildings. And that would be a huge game changer. So I think just in closing, I would say, these are difficult times in many realms for US-China relations. There are many areas of competition between our two countries that are not necessarily very wholesome. But I'll conclude by saying there is an area of competition that I would wholeheartedly encourage as someone who cares a lot about clean energy and climate. And that's really on who can have stronger and more stringent building electrification policy. And the winner of that will help the planet and also help create more comfortable and cheaper homes for their own citizens. So thank you.
Thank you so much for bringing in that idea of a virtuous cycle of friendly competition. I really appreciate that and some of the practical examples that you gave, including from your own life. So thank you so much to all of our panelists. We're now going to turn to the question and answer portion of our discussion. So audience members are invited to type their questions into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. To kick things off, I think maybe Stephanie, maybe I could ask you. So President Biden launched the National Building Performance Standard Coalition, which really aims to work with subnational jurisdictions like California to improve the design and implementation of building policy here in the United States. So I'd love to hear from your perspective or others, what is the role of coalitions like that? Or are there other measures that you think the federal government could do to really help spur state level action on buildings? You gave some examples of some leading states, Washington, New York, others. But what else could the federal government be doing to help support that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in general, the federal government has been doing an incredible job of showing leadership on building decarbonization over the past 1 to 2 years. And so that's just been great. So the first is, I think coalitions like that are fantastic, right? They help jurisdictions learn from other jurisdictions and understand what works well, what hasn't worked well. And so I think that type of coalition that creates a learning environment across different geographies can be incredibly helpful for moving everything forward. And then, yeah, I'm curious what others think about this. So Commissioner McAllister, I'm curious for your views as well on this question.
I agree with the sea change in the federal government over the last couple of years has been remarkable, and just they're walking the walk and putting money where their mouth is, and it's just really great to have that collaboration. One particular area that I thought that the federal government is working on model codes, sort of in earnest, as a reference point for states who are maybe a little bit sort of behind the curve on their own building code development. And so that's a really kind of example setting effort that the Department of Energy is working on hard. The other piece of this where jurisdiction does lie with the federal government is in manufactured housing. And that is a huge and probably growing sector as we move forward. And many states in the country, including California, have a housing crisis and really need to find solutions to building more housing. We just have this scarcity of housing, but manufactured homes are regulated by the federal government, not by the states. And so those building standards, the efficiency measures that are mandatory in manufactured housing really rest completely with the federal government. And so the states really are at the mercy, the 5 to 10% of folks who live in manufactured homes across the country really are their energy bills are kind of at the mercy of those federal standards. So that's a really important place.
Yeah, and one other thing I'll add is the Biden administration did set out an executive order, right? So the federal buildings portfolio itself, which is frankly one of the largest portfolio of buildings in the entire country, they have a policy they need to hit net zero emissions in all federal buildings by 2045, and they need to electrify. And so I think that level of example setting, I think, is really critical as well.
The other area that we're just sort of riffing here, but federal procurement. The federal government procures immense quantities of building materials and all sorts of supplies, and they can really move markets. And a state like California can as well, and we're working on that area. But I think there's a lot of room for collaboration there, and certainly China could absolutely have a huge global impact in that.
Fantastic. I really appreciate how you both bounced off one another's ideas there. So maybe turning to China for a moment. So Nan, you highlighted, some of your research, which is kind of showing that, if we're looking, in the nearer term, within this next decade, that material efficiency really shows is going to be a big driver of where we can achieve emissions reductions. So could you share a little bit more about some of the opportunities that you see, in the nearer term? I know you've done modeling work kind of longer toward carbon neutrality pathways, but just kind of nearer term, next few years, where do you see the biggest opportunities for China?
Yes, so I would say both of these operational and energy side of measurement and this material side and measure needs to be implemented. So particularly for the material efficiency side, I think in the near term, and the programs such as Bike Clean and could actually be very much applicable in China. Chinese government has already have done well in government procurement and for efficient appliances and green building. So they do have a procurement program and to promote the green building materials. Although carbon emission and other GHG emissions are not a part of the equation. And so actually we can leverage those opportunities, whether it's a pilot projects or government policies or labeling, and to include the CO2 emission and in the criteria and for these procurement. And we all know China is actually has a lot of advantage in implementing policies like that, right? And then they do have many state-owned enterprises and public buildings, and all those are could be quickly transformed with this type of policy. At the same time, I think there could be a possibility for codes. As we know, in California, we're also planning to adopt these CO2 emissions in the codes. I think Marin County set a good example of that. And so for China's next codes and updates, we could see if some of the building material embodied emission criteria could be included as well. Similarly, green building labels and could also include the CO2 emission. So I see these are areas that could be, we can make a difference really in the near term. And of course, there are other things like extending the building lifetime, which is not only good for emission, but also good for the safety and the quality and of the building construction. And some of these encouragement of alternative and material use and incentives for that, and could all be adapted and in the near term.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Maybe turning to Commissioner McAllister and or Bob Weisenmiller, so California is really known for taking a cross-agency approach to addressing its climate goals and its carbon neutrality objectives. Is there anything that, you think that could be gleaned from California's experience that might be applicable to China or to other jurisdictions? Any kind of information you'd like to share, and including potentially about the cross-agency approach, or if there are other strategies that where you think California has been particularly successful?
Bob, you want to go first? Well,
Yours not followed, but either way works.
I guess I would point out first, just that's totally right. I mean, we have a fairly complex, multi-agency kind of jurisdictional, panoply of jurisdictions across the state. And we also, as has been said, we do depend on local governments to kind of chart the path. And often local governments have broader authority and deeper authority in certain areas that they can bring to bear on some of these issues. They have particular constituents that may be more progressive than the average across the state. And so we have some local jurisdictions really charting the path. And I think we have to acknowledge that all the agencies learn from those experiences at the local jurisdiction, whether it's a building energy code or reach code, or whether it's police powers, or whether it's land use policy or whatever. Like they have a lot of permitting offices. They have a lot of jurisdictions that the state does not have, or a lot of sort of activities and authorities. On decarbonization of buildings, we're really seeing that the Energy Commission and the Air Resources Board, and to some extent the Public Utilities Commission, all are taking steps forward. And that's really the only way that California is going to get to full building decarbonization, because nobody has the complete jurisdiction to make that happen. Our building code is a building energy code, so it can't actually ban combustion devices that are otherwise permitted under federal law. And so, however, air quality authority can be used under the ARB's state implementation plan, being out of compliance in much of the state for particulates and NOx. They actually get authority from the federal government to go far beyond what we can do. And so they actually have proposed, as I think Anand said, to have maybe 72 in the state implementation plan to have zero emission heating of water and space by 2030. And actually in their recently adopted scoping plan, they're proposing to go beyond that and get to all combustion devices in the residential sector by 2035, including cooktops and clothes dryers and all that. So air quality authority, turns out, is very important to get us to zero in this context of a state within a federal system in the US. China obviously has a different structure and doesn't maybe have some of those constraints.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one thing that was really important in the Brown administration was that the governor set a very clear goal for his agencies to work together. And indeed, we were getting together at least once a month. If you're talking about myself and Mary Nichols, Mike Peavy, Micro Picker, and sort of walking through what we needed to do. And actually, for some of us, I think Picker and I got together once a week and sort of dug into how to cooperate, what each of the agencies were doing, and trying to really work down through the agencies on stuff. Now, having said that, I think the whole fire situation came up much worse, much faster than we anticipated. And, God knows that just in terms of climate change. So I think it's really important to going forward to realize that, things can go bad fast. And, again, the fires is a classic example for California, and how it's really important that the agencies work together to try to deal with those issues.
And reliability is job one. So we're
Yeah.
talking here about decarbonization, but when the reliability rears its ugly head, that focuses everyone's attention, and can set us back a little bit in the near term. But I actually have a lot of faith that California is going to stay the path and really have our reliability and our decarbonization in a way that keeps energy relatively affordable. And so we have the technologies, I think, as Anand said. One example of the PUC, actually, another complementary action is that they've actually disallowed the cost of gas line extensions to be rate-based. And so that's a very important policy measure that they've taken that has, again, sort of leveled the playing field for electrification and decarbonization. So everyone's complementing one another, I think, as much as possible.
Great, thank you all for those perspectives. So we're coming toward the end of our time, but I wanted to kind of close out with one last question kind of to the group, or anyone who wants to chime in. Several of you have already offered many recommendations and suggestions, in the spirit of friendly competition, or other avenues through which the US and China can advance on buildings decarbonization pathways. But I just want to give an opportunity for anyone who wants to come in on the question of, what are the biggest opportunities for the US and China? Are there opportunities for collaboration? Is that a step too far? Are there ways that the US and China could help spur change in other jurisdictions beyond their own borders? Anyone that wants to kind of come in on the kind of big picture opportunities for the US and China kind of as we close out.
I'll just throw out something there, and Non, it sounds like you were about to talk. So actually, why don't you go first, and then I can follow.
Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, so I feel really first area is really net zero energy buildings, right? China made the 2050 and carbon neutrality target, and all sector needs to be net zero. Meaning building sector really needs to be net zero. And I showed you the chart today, 0% net zero energy building. And then Anand also noted, we know how to do it. The technology exists, the case study exists, and countries and states already doing that, right? So, so in order for that to happen, actually China can actually learn some of the policy practice that California has done or US has done, and how do we help kind of using the kind of effective policies to achieve that, or technologies like sensors, controls, right? Many of those. At the same time, and there's a lot of things I think the US can also learn from China in terms of efficiency and conservation behaviors, lifestyle, temperature setting, right? And so all of those, and I think that's a really important area. And if China can set that target and using effective code standards to achieve that, I think that's a big accomplishment. And second area is that the material efficiency, given sensitivities around the US-China collaboration on key and high-tech technologies on these building materials such as cement and concrete, steel, glass, and really benign areas, and usually they're local, right? So this area we also have a lot to share and learn from each other and make progress. And both sides could really advance it.
That's great. I was just going to say two things, which is one, my team is doing some work in the Yangtze River Delta region of China where there is no district heating, and there's a lot of people beginning to adopt furnaces or space conditioners. And so that's and there's 220 million people that live in the Yangtze River Delta, right? So 2/3 of the US population in this one province. And so we have been working together with partners in China to even just share like as simple as case studies of the economics and installation and how can we make sure that as we adopt these appliances in the US, we're sharing learnings and lessons learned. And then, yeah, technology innovation. How do we bring heat pumps down the cost curve? They are already economic in new construction and in so many retrofit situations, but how do we continue to bring those technologies down the cost curve, increase manufacturing, make sure we have millions and millions of heat pumps ready to deploy? I think would be excellent areas where we could collaborate.
Maybe I'll just add that China is like the heat pump manufacturing capital. And a lot of the heat pumps that are being used around the world are actually made and manufactured in China. So the more we can get China to lean into the fact that they are a major manufacturer of a clean technology, and also then stimulate local or domestic demand, as Stephanie pointed out, there's 220 million people in one province, so that's a lot of domestic demand that can be stimulated, which can help their industry. Just the Inflation Reduction Act has its benefits and its downsides. We see a lot of benefits in terms of how much it can decarbonize the U.S. economy. It also feels to our international partners, China or the EU, that it's a little protectionist or industrial policy in nature, which is to some extent that's true. And China, in some sense, can, by focusing on having stronger appliance standards or all electric building codes, can also stimulate their local industry by creating domestic demand, which I think is a good thing.
The only thing I would add is that I think I'd really rather use the term co-opetition because we both need to cooperate and learn from each other, but we also, the friendly competition is also a great thing to move the ball forward. So.
Wonderful. I think that's a great spot to close us out. So unfortunately, we're out of time for this evening. So thankful to have had such wonderful wealth of expertise on this panel this evening. Fantastic conversation. We appreciate all of your time and that of our audience. Again, this event has been recorded and will later be shared on our website and YouTube channel. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us and for all of your contributions to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.